Okay, welcome to part two. We're going to pick up right where we left off on part one. So part one ended, we were talking about the conclusion of the minimum degree of care discussion. So let's now move on to how minimum degree of care fits in with the New York State definition of neglect or neglected child. So remember, a parent or person otherwise legally responsible for a child must provide them with the minimum degree of care. So we're finally to the definition of neglect, which is if a parent or person otherwise legally responsible for a child does not provide the minimum degree of care, and that failure results in harm or imminent harm to the child's physical, mental, or emotional condition, the child has been neglected. So another way of saying this, if the parents don't provide the minimum degree of care and the child is harmed or put in imminent danger of harm because of that, the child is neglected. So we know what actual harm is, right? If a child is clinically depressed or has physical marks or bruises, well, that's actual harm. And actual harm can be neglect, but it's not just actual harm. Putting a child in danger of imminent harm, physically, mentally, or emotionally, is also neglect. And imminent means immediate. It doesn't mean that the child may suffer some harm sometime in the future. It means that they are at risk of immediate harm. So to be neglected, a child's mental, emotional, or physical condition must be harmed or put in imminent danger of harm. It's really important to remember, which is why I'm going out over again, that actual harm is not required. But imminent harm means the child's mental, emotional, or physical condition was put at immediate risk of harm right now, in the next few minutes, in the immediate future. Not sometime on the future, this could have an adverse impact on the child's mental condition. Or sometime in the future, the child's physical health may be impaired because of what the parent did today. That's not immediate or imminent harm. The harm has to be actual or it has to be imminent. So what does imminent mean? Let's look at a few examples. A parent is threatening to punch a child in the face. I want you to picture a parent holding their fist over their kid's head right now and saying, I'm going to punch you right in the friggin' head. Is that imminent harm? Yes, that is absolutely imminent harm. A parent currently right now threatening to punch a child, strike a child, burn a child, that's all imminent harm. They're threatening to do that right now. So the child is at risk of harm, imminent harm. How about a parent who says, one of these days I'm going to kill you. One of these days I'm going to knock your lights out. Is that imminent harm? No, it's not imminent harm because they're threatening to hurt the child in the future. And of course, we know lots of parents say things like, I'm going to kill you. It doesn't mean they're actually meaning they're going to kill the child, right? But saying, one of these days I'm going to knock your block off is not putting the child at imminent harm. But holding your fist over a child's head and threatening to punch them, well, that is putting a child in imminent harm. How about a parent who's so intoxicated, they're so drunk or so high that they're sound asleep and the child is alone with that parent at home and cannot wake the child up? The parent's completely incapacitated. Is the child at imminent risk of harm? Yes, absolutely. That's imminent harm. Right here and now, that parent is so intoxicated. If the child needs something, if the child's injured, if the child runs out of the house, the parent's not even going to know they left. The parent's not going to be able to respond to the child's needs or any emergency. So that is putting a child in imminent harm for a parent to be so intoxicated that they're unresponsive. Here's two other examples, and now we're getting into our primary topic of our course, talking about domestic violence. If parents are screaming at each other and an infant is upstairs sound asleep in their room, that infant is not at risk of imminent harm. They're sound asleep in their room. But if parents are screaming and pushing each other and the child is in the room, well, that child is at imminent danger of harm because those adults are out of control and screaming and pushing while the child is present. It is very possible in the immediate future, right now, that that child could be harmed. Let's go a little further into neglect and domestic violence. Exposing a child to domestic violence can meet the definition of child neglect if the exposure to that domestic violence harms the child physically, mentally, or emotionally, or that exposure to that domestic violence puts them at imminent danger of such harm. That's just our regular definition of neglect, right? We've just put the words domestic violence into it. So exposure to domestic violence can meet the definition of neglect. And here's some factors to consider. If an adult's creating an immediately dangerous environment, that's neglect. If the children are present witnessing the domestic violence and they're terrified, that's neglect. Think of a child trying to physically intervene between parents. One or more of the parents is assaulting each other and a child is physically in between them trying to stop the abusive parent. Well, of course, that child is in imminent risk of harm, physically trying to stop an abusive adult. If adults are throwing objects at each other or physically fighting with the children nearby in the same room or close by, then those children are at imminent risk of harm, and exposing children to domestic violence in that way is neglect. If a child is experiencing depression, anxiety, or other psychological issues due to their exposure to violence in the home, that's actual harm. That's not even threat of harm. If a child's depression, anxiety, or other psychological issues is a direct result of being exposed to domestic violence, then that child has suffered actual harm, and that's neglect. If a police are called to the home and the children are exposed to the police having come to the home to stop the violence that's occurring, if a parent is screaming at a child to call 911 to get the police to the home, that can be putting the child at imminent risk of harm, and therefore that could be neglect. So it's just not as easy as saying, well, there's domestic violence, so there's neglect. First of all, the child has to be aware of it. If the parents are fighting and arguing or even assaulting each other, or if one parent is being physically assaulted, but the children are at school when that happens, under New York state law, that child is not at imminent risk of harm because the child's at school when the assault occurred. However, if any of these other factors are present, the child's in an immediately dangerous environment due to the domestic violence. Or if the child is physically struck, punched, kicked, or an object hits them during an assault from an abusive parent against a victim, well, that child's been actually harmed. And if a child is suffering serious emotional harm, they're suffering clinical depression, anxiety, they're suicidal, they're terrified to leave the home because they're afraid that mom or dad's going to get hurt by the other parent. Well, then that's actual harm, and that's also neglect. So remember, it's just not enough to say domestic violence equals neglect. We have to look at the specific circumstances because in order for there to be neglect, the child has to be harmed, actually harmed, or put at imminent risk of harm. Now I got red print on the screen, so that's warning signs all over. It is critically important you understand the New York State definition of neglect. If you have any questions about this definition, it doesn't make sense to you, or you're having problems memorizing it, or you have any questions about it all, please send me an email and ask, and I can help you. But don't skip over it. Don't just assume, well, I kind of get it, but I don't fully get it and it won't matter. Trust me, it's going to matter. It's going to matter on a quiz and it's going to matter on your final exam. And it's also really important that you know it because if you're going to be working in the field of criminal justice If you're going to be working as a police officer or a probation officer or in corrections, or you're going to be working in a youth facility, if you want to work with victims of domestic violence, it's very important. It's critically important that you know the definition of child neglect in New York State, because you need to know whether or not this is something that should be investigated by Child Protective Services. So any questions about this definition, please ask me right away. Let's look at some examples of neglect. Let's look at some actual cases to see if it's neglect or not. So the first one is that Maria does not have enough food to eat and she's hungry all the time. Maria steals food from other children in school and she's underweight. The parent has been offered public benefits to obtain food, but the parent refuses to accept help. That is definitely neglect. The minimum degree of care requires that the parent provide Maria with adequate food. They have not provided her with adequate food, and as a result, Maria's being harmed. She's hungry all the time to the point she's stealing food. That is neglect. Terry arrives at school in shorts and a t-shirt in cold weather. He's often very dirty and he has a serious odor. Other children will not sit next to him in school. Teachers have offered the child clothing, but the parents refuse it. The parents insist the child is fine and he does not need additional clothing. Well, I said a little bit earlier that we would talk about hygiene. Children do not have to be spotlessly clean, and most children are not. Children play, they spill things, they're messy. It's part of being a kid. But if a child's hygiene is consistently so bad that they have a chronic body odor, that children in school make fun of them or won't sit next to them, if the teachers are complaining that it's hard for them to teach the child or be close to the child because their body odor is so bad, that can meet the level of neglect if the parent does not address the issue. So it might be perfectly fine to kids to have dirt on their pants or mud on their shirt. If their hygiene is so bad that it's difficult for other people to be around them, that can be neglect because the parent has not met the minimum degree of care in their clothing and in their hygiene. Here's another case. Kristen and David are children who live in a filthy house. It's full of rotting garbage, and there's animal feces and vermin throughout the house. There are large holes in the ceiling, and the parents are using the oven to heat the home. Is this neglect? It sure is. Minimum degree of care requires adequate shelter, and while homes may be messy and smelly and dirty, they have to be safe. And having a home full of animal feces and vermin like mice is not safe for a child. That does not meet the minimum standard. Homes also have to have adequate heat, and if parents are using an oven or stove to heat a home, that's actually dangerous. So this home does not meet the minimum standard the parents are required to provide for Kristen and David, and this is neglect. Dan is 8 years old and has not been to the dentist in several years. He is constantly complaining of pain in his mouth, and it's apparent he needs serious dental work. When told Dan must be taken to the dentist, the father responds that he never went to the dentist and Dan doesn't need to go either. Is this neglect? Absolutely. Dan needs to have basic medical care, which includes dental care. And it's not like he just needs a routine exam. He's actually in pain and needs to have work performed in his mouth. So Dan's just refusal to take Dan to the dentist and get this taken care of is neglect. Tammy is in 9th grade and has had 36 unexcused absences in the past 3 months. She's failing 3 of her classes as a direct result of her chronic absenteeism. The school has tried to reach the parents by phone, text, email, and letters, but the parents refuse to respond. Is this neglect? Specifically, is this educational neglect? Yes, absolutely. New York state law says that educational neglect has to be directly tied to unexcused absences. Numerous absences that have no valid reason, and that absenteeism has to be directly related to the child's failure in school or to not receiving essential services. In this case, Tammy's failing 3 of her classes because she's chronically absent for no valid reason. The parents are refusing to even try to do anything about it. Therefore, that's neglect. A Spectrum cable employee was walking past an apartment when he heard a child crying. He knocked on the door and a child about 5 years old opened the door and let him in. There were no adults in the home and the child was crying and upset. The child asked the Spectrum employee to make him something to eat and also asked him to watch a video with him. The Spectrum employee waited in the home for 10 minutes, but when no adult arrived, he called the police for assistance. Is this neglect? Absolutely. Remember that adequate supervision is one of the elements of minimum degree of care. A 5-year-old is not responsible enough or mature enough to be left in the home alone. And clearly, this child's demonstrating he doesn't have that maturity because he opened the door to a stranger, invited a stranger into his home, started talking to him, asked him to make him to something to eat, and even asked him to watch a video to him. That's extremely unsafe behavior for a 5-year-old, and therefore this child should have supervision that prevents him from being in this situation. So this child being left home alone is neglect because the parents failed to provide adequate supervision. John, age 12, left his home without his mother's permission and did not return by his 6 p.m. curfew. When John got home at 7 p.m., his mother repeatedly struck him with a belt. John has belt-shaped marks on his buttocks and on his back. Is it neglect? Well, let's think back to our general guidelines about excessive corporal punishment. We know that the criminal law allows John's mother to punish him physically if she's trying to discipline him, and that's clearly what she's trying to do. But is it excessive? And in this case, the answer is yes. The mother repeatedly struck him with a belt. Using a belt by its very nature can be very dangerous, and we know it in fact caused actual harm. He has belt-shaped marks on his buttocks and back. That is excessive corporal punishment, and therefore it's neglect. Kayla is 4 years old and lives with her guardian. Kayla has learned bad words at preschool, and she started calling her guardian bitch. The guardian slapped Kayla across the face and put soap in her mouth. Is it neglect? Yes. While it's certainly appropriate and we would want this guardian to discipline Kayla, that's definitely inappropriate behavior for Kayla to be using that language. And a good parent is going to discipline Kayla and try to get her not to use that language again. However, slapping a 4-year-old across the face is excessive, and putting soap in her mouth is dangerous. Kayla could choke on the soap could get caught in her throat. Soap is not meant to be consumed by humans. She could have an allergic reaction to it. So the guardian's actions of slapping the 4-year-old across the face and putting soap in her mouth is excessive corporal punishment and therefore neglect. Jordan is 10 years old and occasionally wets the bed at night. When his father discovered he wet the bed again, he made a large sign that said, "I'm a baby and I still wet the bed." Jordan's father put the sign around Jordan's neck so it covered his entire chest. Jordan was then forced to walk up and down the street in front of his house for 30 minutes wearing the sign. Is this neglect? Yes, it is. Remember that parents are allowed to discipline their children and even use physical punishment for the purpose of educating or disciplining their child. But this is meant to humiliate Jordan. The father is trying to make Jordan experience extreme embarrassment for something he can't control. It's very likely Jordan does not enjoy wetting the bed, but for whatever reason it's happening. And this parent is trying to use humiliation to get Jordan to stop. That is excessive corporal punishment, and therefore it's neglect. That's the end of part 2 of the lecture for Module 9. But of course, as always, you have other things you need to do this week. The first is you have an article on 8 types of parents. This article just talks about parents who have mental issues or other problems which causes them to exhibit bad behavior towards their children. And this will give you an idea of different types of problems parents experiencing and how it impacts their kids. You have two media items this week. One is a research article on spanking. People have very, very varied opinions on spanking, and this talks about some recent research that was conducted by two universities on spanking. Your second media item is just a job posting for you to review. The state central register obviously has to hire lots of people to answer calls at the hotline, and this is a job posting for an entry level position, so you can just take a look at that and see what you think. Project number 4 is due Monday, which is November 2nd. For those instructions, just look at the project assignments in the module. And you have extra credit that you can do. If you do it, it's due November 2nd. Remember, you can earn up to 5 points to be applied to your final exam. A lot of students raise their midterm grade by an entire letter grade by having done the extra credit. So really strongly encourage you to do the extra credit. It'll just take you a minute and will earn you a point on your final exam. There is no quiz this week, but here's a warning. Next week's quiz, the quiz for Module 10, is going to cover material from Module 9 and from Module 10. So you will be quizzed on this material. It just won't happen until next week. And you have no textbook assignment this week. As always, if you have any questions or issues, especially if you have problems understanding the definition of neglect or how to apply the definition to real life scenarios, please send me an email and give me a chance to help you out.